It was 3:17 a.m., and Steve Harvey's car smelled like old French fries and desperation. Rain hammered the cracked windshield in erratic bursts, a jazz drummer with no rhythm, as the city slept without caring whether he froze to death. The seatbelt, buckle dug into his ribs, not because he wore it, but because it was the only way to keep his pillow from sliding to the floor. For the last 72 nights, this beat-up 1976 Ford Tempo had been his home, his prison, and his confession booth. The cup holder held more coins than dreams. His last hot meal was 2 days ago, and somewhere, in some air-conditioned club, another comedian was probably telling his joke. Steve clenched the steering wheel as if gripping it harder could change the future. He knew the world saw him as a wannabe, a man too old, too broke, and too unlucky to make it in comedy. But that night, under the static glow of a broken street lamp, he made a silent vow. If I'm going down, I'm going down laughing. It wasn't bravado. It was survival. The road to this moment had been a parade of slammed doors, bad gigs, and unpaid promises. His friends, the ones who hadn't quietly drifted away, begged him to quit. "It's not worth it, Steve," they'd say. "You're 30, you've got no savings, nobody's booking you. You're too old to be new, too new to be booked." But comedy was an itch in his bones, a voice in his head that wouldn't shut up. It was dangerous, too. In the dim-lit green rooms of Cleveland and Chicago, he'd already been whispered about. "Harvey stole that bit," someone had said. Another comic swore he'd seen Steve borrow a punchline without permission. In a world where ego and originality were currency, those whispers could be lethal. Steve hated those rumors, not because they hurt his pride, but because he knew exactly how thin the ice was beneath him. One bad break, one burned bridge, and the dream was gone. And then there were the failures no one knew about. The talent show in '84, where he froze for a full 30 seconds before speaking. The disastrous corporate gig where the CEO walked on stage mid-set and told him to wrap it up in front of 300 people. The audition where a club owner laughed, not at the jokes, but at his suit. Still, here he was. 30 minutes from, now, he'd be on stage in a smoky, half-empty club off Interstate 77, performing for people who didn't know his name, and maybe never would. But in those minutes before the engine turned over, in the stale silence of his Ford Tempo, Steve Harvey wasn't just a broke man chasing a foolish dream. He was a man who believed the punchline could save his life. The first time Steve Harvey walked into the green room at the Funny Bone in Cleveland, the air felt like it had been breathed 100 times too many. It was the smell of cigarette ash, beer foam, and cheap cologne. The smell of dreams in various stages of decay. 3 comics sat on a faded sofa, laughing at a story that Steve didn't hear from the start. They didn't stop when he entered. They didn't even glance his way. In this world, you earned the right to be noticed. The host for the night, a wiry man named Rick Skinny Dog Walters, gave him a slow once-over. "You're the 5-minute guy?" he asked. Steve nodded. "You get laughs, you stay, you bomb, you go back to slinging whatever it is you sling," Skinny Dog said, turning back to his beer. It was meant as a joke, but it wasn't funny that night. Steve waited for his turn, listening from the corner as the other comics threw grenades at the crowd. Some duds, some bombs, some hits. But the real war wasn't on stage. It was in here, behind the curtains, where reputations were traded like poker chips. He stole that closer from Eddie Murphy's Delirious. "Nah, man, I heard him do that joke 2 years ago in Dayton." Doesn't matter. If you do something that feels stolen, you're done. Steve had heard his name in those same types of conversations before. He knew how a rumor could stick like gum on the sole of your shoe. No matter how far you walked, it followed you. It didn't matter if it was true. In comedy, perception was reality. When his turn came, the stage lights blinded him. The crowd was a patchwork of trucker hats. sequined tops, and crossed arms. He launched into a bit about growing up in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business. Halfway through, a man at the bar shouted, "Didn't Sinbad do that one?" Laughter rippled. Not at the joke, but at the accusation. Steve's pulse roared in his ears. He leaned into the mic, smiled, and fired back. "Yeah, but Sinbad don't owe my cousin $50. The crowd erupted. The man at the bar raised his glass. And just like that, Steve had learned a lesson. In stand-up, survival meant turning knives into punchlines before they cut too deep. Backstage, the mood had shifted. A couple of comics gave him nods, the kind that said, "Okay, you're not bad." But not everyone was impressed. One guy, a thin, angular man named Donnie Keats, cornered him by the sink. "Hey, man," Donnie said, voice low. "That thing about your cousin? I've heard that set before." Steve frowned. "No, you haven't." Donnie smirked. "Whatever you say. Just know people talk." That was the thing about this life. Even when you were broke and nameless, someone was already sharpening their knives. The gigs kept coming, but barely. $50 here, 75 there. Sometimes a meal was part of the pay. Steve learned to stretch a burger into 2 meals by ordering extra napkins and wrapping. Half for later. He learned which motels would let you talk your way into a free night if you told the right sob story. He learned to keep his jokes written in a notebook small enough to hide, because yes, people did steal material, and they didn't always. Wait until you were famous to do it. But what he didn't expect was how much of comedy wasn't comedy at all. It was politics. There were gatekeepers, club owners, bookers, senior comics, who decided who moved up and who stayed scraping the floor. One wrong word, one bad night, and you were out. Sometimes permanently. One night in Akron, Steve shared a bill with a veteran comic named Lenny the Machine Rollins. Machine had been headlining for 20 years, but the crowd that night was dead, until Steve went up. For 15 straight minutes, they roared. Machine's set afterward felt flat, almost tired. 2 days later, the club canceled Steve's next booking. No reason given. But word trickled back. Machine had told the booker Steve wasn't ready, that he didn't respect the headliner's slot. It was the first time Steve realized that sometimes the man who shook your hand was the same man who pulled the rug from under your feet. In the Ford Tempo that night, Steve scribbled in his notebook, "Rule number 1, the crowd is not your enemy. The crowd is the only friend you have." Rule number 2, if someone says you stole a joke, even if you didn't, you lost the argument. Rule number 3, don't outshine the wrong person. Not everyone wants you to win. He stared at the page until the ink blurred. Then he closed the notebook and whispered to himself, "They can say what they want. I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to be undeniable." It was a Thursday night in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of night where the wind blew so hard it felt like it was trying to erase the town off the map. Steve's stomach was a hollow drum, echoing every step he took toward the Barrel House, a small club wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop. The sign out front read, "Comedy Night, 3 cover, 2 pitchers." Inside, the smell was a bitter cocktail of bleach and stale beer. The stage was barely higher than the dance floor, and the microphone leaned like it had given up on standing. Steve had been booked for a 20-minute set, his longest yet. 20 minutes was gold. If he nailed it, word could spread to bigger clubs. If he bombed, well, in those days, bombing wasn't just an ego bruise. It meant no dinner, no gas money, no reason for a booker to ever call you again. The first 5 minutes went smooth. A joke about growing up poor got chuckles. A bit about his uncle's busted car got a few real laughs. And then, without warning, the microphone cut out. At first, he thought it was a loose cable. He tapped the mic, wiggled the cord. Nothing. From the bar, someone yelled, "Guess God's tired of your jokes!" The crowd laughed, but not with him. Steve tried to shout over the noise, but his voice got swallowed by the clink of beer glasses and the grinding of the ice machine. He looked to the side for help, but the bartender just shrugged. The owner, a bald man in a leather vest, stood with his arms crossed. Steve's 20 minutes collapsed into 12 as he waved awkwardly and left the stage. Back in the green room, which in this case was just a hallway behind the bar, two comics were whispering. They didn't see him come in. "Told you he wasn't ready for a headline slot." "Yeah, man, he's good for 5, maybe 10. But 20? Nah. You see him freeze?" It wasn't the mic they blamed. It was him. Later, Steve would find out the mic malfunction wasn't an accident. The headliner that night, a man with a thick mustache and a bigger ego, had told the owner to test the new guy. Cutting the mic was a way to see if he could swim without a life jacket. He hadn't. That night, in the Ford Tempo, Steve sat with his hands on the wheel but didn't start the engine. He thought about driving back to Cleveland, calling it quits, finding a real job. He could still hear the laughter from the crowd, not at his jokes, but at his failure. It clung to him like cigarette smoke. Then came the hunger. The gnawing physical reminder that quitting meant not just giving up a dream, but also giving up the little bit of hope that kept him alive. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a crumpled bag of peanuts from a gas station, and ate them one by one like they were gold coins he couldn't spend all at once. The next day, he called a friend, a comic named Reggie who'd been grinding the Midwest circuit for years. "They set you up," Reggie said without hesitation. "That's old school hazing. They don't want you taking their stage time. You're a threat now." "A threat? I bombed." Reggie chuckled. "Doesn't matter. You got laughs in the first 5. That's enough to scare a man who's been coasting on the same set for a decade." Steve didn't know whether to feel flattered or furious. 2 weeks later, he was back in Cleveland, playing a bar so small the stage was just a corner with a single spotlight. He decided that if anyone ever cut his mic again, he'd finish the set without it. Yell, pantomime, crawl into the audience if he had to. Anything but freeze, and he got his chance sooner than expected. At a gig in Toledo, the mic went dead. Again, this time mid-joke. Steve didn't even blink. He jumped off the stage, walked straight to a table in the middle, and started doing the bit to their faces like it was an improv show. The crowd roared. The owner, caught off guard, booked him again on the spot. Still, the whispers didn't stop. Some said he'd stolen his uncle's busted car bit from a comic in Chicago. Others claimed he worked dirty rooms where the audience was too drunk to notice recycled material. Steve knew that fighting the rumors directly was a trap. If you defended yourself too hard, you sounded guilty. So he doubled down on writing. Every night after gigs, he'd sit in the Ford Tempo and fill pages with new setups, new punchlines. He even started keeping 2 versions of each joke, one clean, one raw, so he could adapt to any crowd. But success wasn't a straight climb. There were still nights where the silence from the crowd was so deep, it felt like he was performing into a vacuum. Nights when he'd drive hours for a gig, only to find out it had been canceled and no one bothered to call. Nights when the gas gauge needle hovered over empty and there was no payday in sight. One night, after a set in Columbus, Steve pulled into a rest stop and saw another comic he knew, a guy named Vince, who'd been at this for over a decade. Vince was sitting in his own car, engine off, staring at nothing. "You good?" Steve asked. Vince shrugged. "Good enough. You?" Steve laughed. "Same." They sat in silence for a while, 2 soldiers in the same losing war. Finally, Vince spoke. "Don't let them see you hungry, Steve. Hungry comics make desperate choices. That's when you start stealing jokes or selling out or quitting. And quitting's worse than dying." Steve didn't know it yet, but that sentence would stick with him for the rest of his career. It was a Friday in 1989 when Steve Harvey walked into the Uptown Comedy Corner in Atlanta, a club with real lights, real sound, and an audience that wasn't just killing time until last call. The moment he stepped in, the atmosphere hit him, like a wall. The warm hum of conversation, the smell of fried catfish and collard greens, the sharp scent of whiskey in thick glasses. This wasn't just a room. It was an arena for gladiators who fought with words instead of swords. He wasn't booked on the main bill. He'd come for the open mic, hoping to impress the club's gatekeeper, a sharp-eyed man named Cliff Madison, who decided who got paid spots and who got laughed out of the building. Steve went on fourth. The first three comics were solid, but the crowd was restless. A couple near the front was arguing. Two guys in the back were talking louder than the stage. The host leaned into Steve's ear as he handed over the mic. "They're cold, man. Don't take it personal if they don't bite." Steve didn't nod, didn't thank him. Just walked to center stage, let the room go quiet for half a breath, and said, "I'm Steve Harvey, and I drove 6 hours to tell y'all jokes, so either you laugh or I'm sleeping in your driveway tonight." The crowd cracked. The couple in the front stopped bickering. The guys in the back leaned in. He launched into a story about a childhood fight over a pair of church shoes, twisting it until the audience was doubled over. 15 minutes later, he walked off to real applause. Not the polite kind, but the "we'd pay to hear that again" kind. Cliff Madison called him over after the show. "You free next weekend?" Steve's heart jumped. "Yeah." "Good. Got a slot for you before the headliner. Paid gig, $100. $100 felt like a fortune. It was gas for 2 weeks, food for even longer if he stretched. But more than that, it was proof that maybe, just maybe, this insane gamble was starting to pay off. The next weekend, Steve hit that stage like he'd been born there. The crowd ate up every line. By the time the headliner came on, the energy was so high it felt electric. That's when the trouble started. Backstage, Steve overheard the headliner, a veteran named Lou Silk Suit Daniels, telling Cliff, "You there. Can't put him on right before me. He's too hot. Makes my set feel cold." Steve pretended not to hear, but the words burned. It was the same pattern he'd seen before. Do well enough to get noticed, and someone in power would find a reason to clip your wings. The following week, Cliff called him. "Listen, Lou's got a point. You're strong, but you gotta learn to build the room instead of blowing the roof off. I'm moving you to an earlier slot. Still paid, but less time." Steve said, "Okay," but inside he wanted to scream. This was the trap no one warned him about. Doing too well could be just as dangerous as bombing. Over the next month, the whispers started again. He's trying to burn the headliners so he can take their spots. That new bit about his grandma? I heard a guy in Detroit do the same thing. Steve kept his head down. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just wrote more jokes, refining every beat until there was no way anyone could claim they weren't his. Then came the night everything changed. It was a sold-out Friday. Steve was back in the middle slot, and the crowd was rowdy in the best way. He opened with a new bit about a family reunion gone wrong. It hit hard. He rolled into another about church choir politics. It hit harder, and then, as he wrapped his closer, something strange happened. Cliff Madison, the gatekeeper himself, stepped out from the side of the stage and whispered into Steve's ear. "Don't get off. Keep going." Steve blinked. He'd never been asked to go longer than his set time. He launched into every extra joke he had, riffed with the crowd, improvised lines he didn't know he had in him. When he finally stopped, the applause shook the walls. After the show, Cliff pulled him aside. "You just saved the night," he said. "Lou's plane got delayed. You held the room for 40 minutes and didn't lose them once. That's rare. You got the headline slot next month." For the first time in years, Steve allowed himself to believe that maybe this was the start of something real. But the thing about a door opening in show business is that the moment you step through, someone's already trying to slam it shut. Following week, an anonymous letter showed up at the club. It claimed Steve was lifting jokes from 3 different comics and using personal sob stories to manipulate the crowd. Cliff never said who sent it, but Steve knew. It was someone who'd smiled in his face, shaken his hand, maybe even shared a drink with him, and still wanted him gone. That night, back in the Ford Tempo, Steve didn't write jokes. He wrote something else in his notebook. I don't have to be liked. I don't have to be clean, I just have to outlast them. It was 1990 when the phone call came. Steve was in a friend's spare room, his first steady roof in months, when the voice on the other end said, "We want you for showtime at the Apollo. You'll be the host for amateur night." Fucker. Words hit like electricity. This was it. The Apollo wasn't just another gig. It was the gateway to the national stage. One solid set there, and you weren't just a comic grinding in bars anymore. You were somebody. He flew to New York on a ticket he could barely afford, stepping onto 125th Street in Harlem with a battered suitcase and a suit so cheap it made him itch. But the moment he saw the Apollo's marquee, those bold white letters glowing against the night, he knew every mile in that Ford Tempo had been worth it. Backstage, it was chaos. Stagehands yelling, comics pacing, singers warming up. A man in a sharp gray suit, the stage manager, handed him a clipboard. You've got 3 minutes to warm them up. If they don't love you by then, they'll boo you off. The Apollo crowd, they don't play nice. Steve smiled. Crowds and I got history. The first minute went well. He teased the front. Rowe riffed about the Harlem weather, made a joke about his suit that got a big laugh. The second minute, he went into a story about his mama making him go to church sick. Another hit. By the third, they were with him completely. When the headliner came on stage, Steve stepped into the wings, his heart pounding, a voice in his head whispering, "This is it. You belong here." But the shadows followed. The next day, a comedian from Chicago, someone Steve had once called a friend, went on a radio show and said, "Man, that was Harvey on the Apollo? Funny, but I swear I heard some of those bits before. From me." The comment made its way into the press. A couple of entertainment columns ran the headline, "New Apollo host accused of joke theft." Steve wanted to explode, but his manager, a sharp, chain-smoking woman named Carla, stopped him. "You defend yourself too hard, it keeps the story alive. Let it pass." "It's a lie." "Doesn't matter. You kill on stage, that's the only answer they can't argue with." So he did. Week after week, he went back to the Apollo and killed. He sharpened his set until every line hit like a hammer. The crowd stopped seeing him as a new face and started seeing him as the guy. But the whispers never completely died. At comedy festivals, someone would mention it in passing. In green rooms, he'd catch a glance that said, "I've heard things." It hurt, not because he doubted himself, but because he knew the truth didn't matter as much as the story people preferred to tell. One night, after a show, an old rival from Cleveland cornered him. "You made it," the man said, almost smiling. "Guess all those nights in your car paid off." "Guess so," Steve replied. The man leaned in. "Just remember, fame don't erase the past. It just makes more people want to rewrite it." Steve went home that night to his own apartment, small, but his, and sat at the kitchen table with a blank page in front of him. He thought about the car, the hunger, the sabotage, the rumors. He thought about how close he'd come to quitting, and then he wrote in big letters across the page, "I outlasted them." Epilogue. Years later, when the world knew him as a talk show host, a game show king, and a man in sharp suits, Steve would sometimes tell the story of sleeping in his car. But he'd never go too deep into the green room wars, the cut mics, the whisper campaigns. Those battles belonged to the part of his life when the only thing keeping him alive was the belief that if he could get just one more chance, he could. Turn the laughter into a shield against everything trying to tear him down. And he was right. But the shield was never perfect. Because in comedy, like in life, the spotlight always brings the shadows with it.